is the secret of the Grail? Who does it serve?
You, my lord.
Who am I?
You are my lord and king. You are Arthur.
Have you found the secret that I have lost?
Yes. You and the land are one.
What is the secret of the Grail? You and the land are one.
You and the land are one.
It's led by a psychosocial, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yes.
Whom does it serve? It has to serve you because you have to be adapted to it. And if you're not adapted to it, you neglect it, you neglect yourself. What is within, so too is without. That is the secret of the Grail. If you neglect your relationship to the world, you will die on the inside and it will suffer on the outside because you are continuous. That is the answer to the Grail question. It's that simple, it is that profound, it is that fulfilling, in the same sense that when the Grail was filled and handed to Arthur and he drank from it, he understood that he was one continuous being. He and the land were one. What is within, so too is without. By his libido shall you know him. When his libido was depleted, he did not relate properly to himself or to the world. That included his psychosocial role, which, because he was a king, meant that he was in effect the ego, the executive of the interaction between his people and the world and the land. He was held responsible for that. The unconscious holds the ego responsible for its action in the world. That's the secret of the Grail. What are you doing with yours?
So one of the things that you guys have talked about the most in terms of psychosystems analysis is the prime importance of one returning back to their instincts, which is very conducive to improving mental health. And especially on our Discord server, we see it all the time. When it comes to instincts, what are they? And Pangsep, at the moment, I'd say, is many people's favorites to go and explain what instinct might be. But of course, there's more to mankind, human beings, than just the Pangsepian emotional systems. And first of all, those emotional systems weren't discovered in humans, they were discovered in animals. So that's one first thing. I was wondering broadly, what could those limitations around just going with Pangsep be? Obviously, it's important that one knows what the seeking system is, the care system is, the lust system is, etc., etc. But what are those immediate limitations that you guys have seen?
Right, thanks, James. That's important. I'd like to start positively about this and say that the great work that they've done, we all know, all three of us are on the clinical register as clinical fellows of the International Neuropsychoanalysis Society. So we are informed insiders, having taken the necessary training to understand this. But then, of course, we can move on to the limitations that you've indicated that might be there. So to start positively with that, yes, they were originally animal models, but Jaak Panksepp was a clinical psychologist originally before he moved into the study of animals. So he already had a human mental health model in mind. Bringing neuroscience proper into it, which he did do, and Mark Solms collaborated with him on this, as did others. They were able to demonstrate that the 7 basic emotional systems that they identified mapped on both as structures and pathways within the brain, so we can say that they are real. They were aware of the limitations themselves, so that they talked about them, each of them being complexities within complexities of interaction. So that's fine. That's the degree of resolution that's been possible thus far. And I think it is really helpful. However, I do agree. We both do, and you're aware of this yourself, because I know you share a similar view, that it does not describe the full range of instincts And then we'd have to come down to an understanding of just what instincts are as well. So there's kind of two responses there to the original question. But thanatos is an instinct in our view, and that's being avoided by many neuropsychoanalysts at the moment. But it does go back to Freud. Freud believed there was a death drive, a drive to be recycled. He formulated that under the influence of Sabrina Spielrein, who was, of course, a patient of Jung's in somewhat unfortunate circumstances, but also a patient of Freud. She later became a Freudian analyst. And under the influence of the First World War and the industrial level of death that was involved in that conflict. And there was a pandemic around too, the Spanish flu pandemic in 1918. So yes, the thanatos, as we discussed in the videos, exists for sure. It's in a lot of mental illness. It's a normal dynamic though as well, particularly as people get older. The psychology has to adjust to that. Jung understood there was an adjustment to getting old. Destructive behaviors, you see thanatos acting there as well, and it's discussed in the personal myth guide, just what that means and all the different variations on that. So that's one, thanatos. There are many other instincts too, which combine with one another to produce an effect that we would label as being an instinct, say the survival instinct, but many other instincts will feed into the drive to survive, you could say. So understanding what instincts are is important. So thanatos isn't covered by them. Basic survival isn't, that kind of thing. The care system involves, for us, all kinds of social interaction and social caring for others. It's connected to play, the play instinct, which has to do with hierarchies and that kind of thing. So you'd need to bring both of those in to explain it properly. So that would be a limitation as well. And then you have, and this is our contribution at the moment to neuropsychoanalysis, a consideration of complexes. This is Jung's idea of complexes, but also what archetypes either are or might be in relation to instincts. That's something I think in the context of this video that would be useful to discuss.
Yeah, on that as well, I can't see how simply taking a Panksepian model could jive with the 5-stage confirmation model across the lifespan either. There has to be an instinct or set of instincts that expect, say, a mother and then need to be confirmed so lifespan development can move forward. I think perhaps with something like that, Jung can be brought in with his focus on imagery and innate images, and as you were saying, archetypes. That could be a way to go into that topic.
Yes, for sure. We do have a model, as you know, which basically runs initially in a linear progression, which goes genome, gene expression, instinct, drive, affect, cognition, action in the world. So if we consider something that is linear in that sense and is on a time release from the genome via gene expression into an instinct, and I'll come back to define that in the way that we mean, the instinct then produces a drive, which is Freud and Jung's libido, the energy to act something out. It then becomes affective. It's an emotional level of consciousness as understood by Jaak Panksepp, Mark Solms and neuropsychoanalysis. It may then reach cognition, or it may go directly into action in the world. When it does reach cognition, this is where the opportunity for neurosis first emerges, because it's at that point that complexes are likely to interfere. Secondarily, the world itself will interfere. And then there's the back pressure from that, which will again feed into complexes and start to repress drives, instincts, and so forth. So for us, the instinct is an innate anticipation. It's a system which is four-dimensional in the sense that it takes time into consideration. It's always forward in its projection. It's never regressive. Instincts are always adapted to the future, which is why the idea of thanatos is important, because the anticipation of death is built in as well. We know this in our genome. At that level, the genome regulates our lifespan. Therefore, the anticipation of death is instinctive and is present. And in some people, there is the drive to die. There is the affect associated with that. There is the cognition about it, and then there's action in the world to do it. For example, someone who is connected to a particular ideology may sacrifice their own life. As recently happened in our home city up here in Liverpool, in the UK. People can do the same thing to sacrifice themselves for others. I would argue that that is thanatos, and that the genome says it's okay to trigger this now on the basis of an algorithm which basically sums up everything to do with the relationship of the individual to his family, his peer group, wherever. The genome will release that and say, go for it, sacrifice yourself now, prematurely, but it's okay to do it. So that's an example, for example, of how thanatos would work. So instincts then are four-dimensional. They're not individual characters, they're not reflexes, like a spinal arc reflex when somebody taps your knee and your knee jerks. It's far more complicated than that. It has a complete understanding of the environment, of social relationships, of anticipations, of goals, and an impetus to achieve itself. So it's a big thing, it's a scenario, like the narrative in a movie, for example, or the through line of a novel, in effect are portrayals of instinctive processes. That's what instincts are. Even if you have an instinct to eat in order to survive, that's a metabolic indication that you need nutrition. It then emerges in consciousness from the unconscious in the form of an image with a drive attached to it and a goal, which is to serve nutrition and therefore survival. But we may think cognitively before we do the action in the world. I feel like something. We even say it. I feel like eating something. I fancy this particular food, not that one. This isn't cognitive. It's already been delivered in the form of an image and the impulse to act in the world. So that is an instinct of a specific kind, but there are others to do with mating and relating, and to do with actualizing or optimizing your potential in the world psychosocially, which is good for you as an individual, it's good for the group, it's good for the genome. These things are instincts. What illustrates the instincts, the images, the components of it, when they appear in consciousness, they very often take on the form of characters and relationships. That's what's mistaken to be a Jungian archetype, as an independent factor separate to instincts. Jung said they were connected, but at opposite ends of a spectrum. I don't think that's true. I think that's an error brought about by the perception of the construct or the concept of what instinct was at the time that he was alive. Now it seems to be far better understood that instinct is a complete thing that includes emotion, but includes everything else. And we become partially conscious when we need to be, usually. And when we don't need to notice we're not, because very often the drive bypasses consciousness and we act in the world. But when we need to know it, because it will augment our capacity to fulfill that instinct, then we get the impression of a character. And then when we interact with that character, we generate a complex that sits on the image of the character, but the character itself is the expression of the instinct. It's not separate. So Jungian archetypes are instincts, they are not separate. And we have them as humans because we have an evolved brain. Our instincts have evolved too. They're not just the same as an amoeba's would be or any other primitive or lower level animal. We have the impression and an imagery sense of these so-called archetypes because they are instinctive, not because they are separate. It's the apperception of the instinctive drive and intentionality that we interpret as being archetypes, but they're not separate. And if we do separate them, we generate a cognitive construct or a model, which is an additional layer of understanding that is unnecessary. And in fact, it can displace and distract us and move us away into complexes and maladaptations. So that would be one answer.
Yeah, thank you. I think it does come down to definition sometimes with how easily these things can be communicated. But take a strict biologist, for example, say sitting in on this conversation. I think a question might come up, which is what's therefore the difference between something that's instinctive and something that's simply within the genome itself? I say that because gene expression itself as a process is a gene is expressed and then it will decay, and the decay is part of its teleology, if you like, and it will act in an overall system, in a systems biology sense, go from the genome, epigenome, proteome, transcriptome, etc., etc. So could we say that everything that is genomic is not necessarily functionally clinically, but as a definition is instinctive?
Well, again, that's a really good point. Even when we define instincts in the way that we do, that's for ease. It's a heuristic. It's an aid to understanding a complicated, we could model it as biopsychosocial construct, the kind of thing that you mentioned earlier, or a phenomenon. So if we look at a process through a certain lens, we can see instinct. I believe personally that instincts are real. I believe, in fact, I'm absolutely certain of this, that what Jung called archetypes are indistinguishable from instincts, but are contained by them. That's an artifact of cognition and apperception, internal perception, and resonance with cultural representations that produces this illusion. But down at the level that you're mentioning is once information is released and it transduces after that transcription process has occurred and the decay at the biological level of gene expression has occurred, the information is released to another level of analysis, description, and explanation where it takes on its own understanding, its own meaning, its own resolution, and it further transcribes upwards as information and energy between systems levels. So it requires that. But it's what is produced by that, which is the end product. And that, again, is part of the misunderstanding when people see archetypes as being things in and of themselves, separate overall to that biopsychosocial phenomenon which produces them.
Yeah, with an explanation like that, I think such a thing becomes self-evident regarding archetypes versus instincts. Also, the idea that archetypes would have evolved as their own thing would never wash with any biologist whatsoever. It just wouldn't. How does having a particular story in one's head, and I mean that sort of technically, because that's what it would look like, convey an evolutionary advantage in a discrete step? You know, you'd have to evolve an archetype all at once, because half an archetype probably isn't adaptive. Instincts, though, yes, and considering them in their biological context, yes, a small little piece of biology that is adaptive does work. It does work, but a small little piece of an archetype, I can't see how that would work.
Yeah, there's a number of things there. Thank you for that, James. Consciousness and what that is a problem, obviously. I mean, they talk about the hard problem of consciousness, but there are other problems which are equally important to that one, which probably will end up being a material answer. And I don't want to upset people, although I'm not particularly bothered, frankly, who might be into philosophy and start to worry about such things. But my view is because it includes, and it necessarily includes, biology, you cannot separate from it. So for me, that's enough in empirical or on empirical grounds to satisfy the hard problem. I'm not bothered about that. What I am concerned about with is understanding how consciousness functions psychologically within its own level. That's what Jung was concerned with himself. For him, psychology was that which could be represented psychologically. And when these instincts appear in consciousness, they appear in a specific representational form that we can understand, which goes back to what you were saying. And understanding why that takes place, that's crucial for understanding it at a psychological level. And that's where mistakes can be made. Because if we project our ego consciousness, what it knows, what it can access inwards in an attempt to understand what's emerging outwards, we don't receive, we don't understand, we impose top down. And when it comes to instincts, if instincts are to have any representation in consciousness, then they have to be capable of taking up a form that represents them completely enough to be understood. And the key is completely enough. That doesn't mean all of it. And sometimes it can mean none of it. Because as I was saying earlier, instinctive pressure can just push past consciousness. It is conscious in an affective sense, in the sense that neuropsychoanalysts understand it, but it can bypass the need for egocentric, reflexive cognition and we just act. We act on impulse and we think about it as an afterthought. That's different. So there's two different kinds of consciousness that work simultaneously. Sometimes they collaborate, sometimes they don't. And that's an opportunity, as I say, for neurosis. And something emotional tries to push through and cognition tries to repress it, can't solve it. The outside world is pushing as well. The split occurs, sometimes defensively, sometimes traumatically, without the ego trying to partition. It's forced apart. A complex tries to bridge that gap, and it sits there and it causes problems. And the complex has some emotion. You know, Jung thought that that was the glue that held the ideas together, but it seems to be that affect is not the glue as such, but that which actively brings cognition into relationship to it, to give it meaning, which is what Pauline was saying earlier about the importance of meaning. Meaning is absolutely everything to humans.
It is indeed, and for me, the one talking about Panskep and the basic emotional systems, the thing that's missing for me in all of that with respect to instincts is creativity.
Yeah.
And of course, in thinking about creativity, inevitably you think about meaning and making and the making of meaning. And people like Clarissa Pinkola Estes, for example, refers to creativity as the lyrical language of the self. So we're back to the idea of the genomic self, and gene expression and the importance of that. And again, even at a biological level, the importance of creativity for survival, because obviously the more adaptable you are, the more that you can craft your life in such a way that you're better adapted, more successful, you have more meaning, then obviously that's better for you in terms of your health and your overall homeostasis. So creativity is for me is the big one that's missing, really, in all of this, because of its significance for the meaning and the quality that it brings to our lives. Yeah,
it pushes things forward, doesn't it? It creates change in some of its forms that's externally referenced to a group, and then technology, for example, will emerge as a form of creativity. Art does as well, for its own sake, but art appears to have a resonant value, so that a culture or a group will relate to it. So there is something intrinsically valuable about art that's not perhaps so obvious to cognition as creativity in the form of technology is, for example, but they do both serve a purpose and they're connected by that creative act. So we have an impulse, we have a drive to create, to produce, to advance things, and art as creativity definitely is inwardly connected, where technology is outwardly connected, and there's so many ramifications off from that, because both can become perverted or corrupted. You know, technology certainly can, art can, you know, and the balance, finding the balance under instinctive pressure from within to correct for the ego or the group attitude towards either technology or art in the form of general creativity, that's evidence in history. History's littered with that, and with the dynamics of that, the pressure of that. And that's when we see complexes on an individual level forming, but also at the level of the nation state, and then ideas becoming overvalued and reified, and the way that the cortex deals with that by making associations, complexes latch onto that, try and suppress, divert, or whatever, canalize instincts, and we get the mess that is the common everyday experience of human life.
It's a completely unnecessary category, isn't it?
It is.
Archetype. You really don't need it to explain or understand anything.
No, you don't. And Jung's personal history explains why he created that concept. Yeah. Adequately explains it, and also why nobody else has bothered with it. Other than the people directly influenced by him.
I agree with you guys. Yeah, it's a redundant category, I think evidently so in the final analysis, but then we also need to expand instinct properly in a systems sense. Yeah. And I don't mean because of the reductionists on the internet who say, you know, just returning to instinct makes one an animalistic monster.
Yeah.
It's more because I've seen bits of Freud and some neuropsychoanalysts who, some of it seems to boil down to, if someone just has a lot of sex, they'll be very happy because there's the lust circuit that's present and that seems to underpin everything. And if that's satisfied, then no neurosis. And it's like, that's also not true either. I'm thinking about the Freudian link between addiction and sex.
Yeah.
How apparently they stack up with the lust circuit, which is true to some degree, but also evidently it's not in the real world, looking at real people. So that needs to be expanded out. You know what I mean?
I do. Thank you for that. That was what Pauline, I think, was saying about meaning, and that is Jungian. The idea that meaning transcends split off instincts, which are basically just powering complexes. I mean, that kind of thing that you mentioned by way of example, to do with lust and just attempted satiation in that way, can be described as an instinct, but to do so, you have to make a figure ground separation. So in other words, they are being reductionistic when they do that. They separate lust and the person who enacts on their lust out from the context of their life, which includes their biology and their social environment.
Yeah.
So there's a lack of meaning. And there's a complex which is working on a behavioral modification level where it's just intercepting instincts and converting everything into lust at that point, because Freud would agree that libido can be turned into anything. Yes. Jung would agree too. So you can canalize and affect libido into sex as a symbolic or a neurotic maladaptation to other drives which are necessary. Jung would certainly agree with that as well.
Yeah, you're right about taking things out of context, because you could put lust into a loving relationship, and suddenly it would have meaning.
Completely different.
And it's a completely different way of looking at it, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, addiction and the addiction circuits, etc., and pathways, that's fine. They are real, but they are still abstractions. And it's the totality that it's important, because these things can be switched off as easily as they were switched on, that they were caused. They had a cause, they have an etiology behind the history of why that circuit was overemphasized or overamped. And if we just then take the resultant effect of that and abstract that out, well, then we create a problem with its own self-limiting boundaries, and it's very difficult to sort that out without creating fantasies about it and talking about addictive personalities. Anybody under the right conditions will be addictive because the pathways that are required to create that exist. That does not mean that you should look at that in isolation to other things.
I think you said, didn't you, Steve, the other day about archetypes? There's no place for it in the system stack,
no,
as such.
No,
in terms of its representation, it's just completely unnecessary.
It is, and it's in the IPSA biopsychosocial stack, approved of by Professor George Engel, who was a professor of psychiatry and medicine and a Freudian psychoanalyst. He approved of the archetypal image system being placed in there. The image system, it's a relation. It's about images. It's about representation. It's not about a biological thing in and of itself. And Jung would have to agree with that we have a perception of archetypes that he thought were otherwise unrepresentational. You can't represent them unless it's in a psychological form. And that's why he said that we experience them. Well, yes, sure. But Jung has split off there from the obvious that it is still metabolic. It's still organic. It is still physical, even when it's an image that's represented in the brain. That's real. That's not outside of you. It's in there. And it's a product of those pathways that are capable of producing a representational image to consciousness. We know now, for example, that the visual cortex, the primary visual cortex, is that we use in everyday life. Like I'm looking at the screen now, looking at you, your representation, James, on the screen, is involved not only in real perception of sensory information, but also in fantasy, in imagery, and in dreams. So those parts of the brain will be active physically in representing these things that Jung called archetypal images to consciousness, which itself has a physical, material, biological presence. But he just veers off into fantasy again. And a psychological reductionism, which says it's not real unless I can experience it. Well, you do, but what you're experiencing is an epiphenomenon or a resonance of biology that reaches a level of complexity, of organization, self-organization, that we then, through the hard problem of consciousness, experience as an image.
Well, we were saying even the likes of pregnant women who have cravings, suddenly an image of a particular food will appear in consciousness and you feel you absolutely have to have it. But that's, you know, that's a metabolic thing, really, isn't it, underpinning it? Exactly.
Because it is a hunger drive.
Well, it is a hunger drive, but for very specific food groups. And it's as if your body, your biology knows that that's what you need, and it gives you the image and consciousness.
It's in a context outside of normal hunger because it has to do with a fetus.
Yes, yeah.
And so your genome's very heavily invested in getting that right.
Indeed, yeah.
But it's separate from your own nutrition as a mother, but it's still there. And this happens top down because you can get an image in the environment which then affects you at the level of gene expression, which has consequences downstream of that, which could be very unpleasant. If it's something very stressful or threatening, you might develop hypersecretion of acid in your stomach, leading to gastric erosion, leading to cancer, leading to your death. So how we treat these things that influence us is very, very important. We need to understand we are one system. We are continuous with our environment. The psychology of us is continuous with our biology. It's a resonant pattern of the exchange of energy and information, and we have to get that profile right. For ourselves, that's homeostasis, and for others, that's psychotherapy, non-psychoreductive psychotherapy.
Yeah, such a thing exists.
It does indeed, and it has for many decades.
Yeah.
What is the secret of the Grail? You and the land are one.
You and the land are one.
It's like biopsychosocial, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yes.
Whom does it serve? It has to serve you because you have to be adapted to it. And if you're not adapted to it, you neglect yourself. What is within, so too is without. That is the secret of the Grail. If you neglect your relationship to the world, you will die on the inside and it will suffer on the outside because you are continuous. That is the answer to the Grail question. It's that simple. It is that profound. It is that fulfilling, in the same sense that when the Grail was filled and handed to Arthur and he drank from it, he understood that he was one continuous being. He and the land were one. What is within, so too is without. By his libido shall you know him. When his libido was depleted, he did not relate properly to himself or to the world. That included his psychosocial role, which, because he was a king, meant that he was in effect the ego, the executive of the interaction between his people and the world and the land. He was held responsible for that. The unconscious holds the ego responsible for its action in the world. That's the secret of the Grail. What are you doing with yours?
You and the land are one. Drink.
I'm wasting away. I cannot die. And I cannot live.
Drink from the chalice and you will be reborn and the land with you.
Percival. I didn't know how empty was my soul until it was filled.
Arthur!
Ready my knights for battle. They will ride with their king once more. I've lived through others far too long. Lancelot carried my honor, and Guinevere my guilt. Mordred bore my sins. My knights have fought my causes. Now, my brother, I shall be king.
Guards! Knights! Squires! Prepare for battle!